When my in-laws looked at my kids, they saw nothing but spares, but when their golden grandchild walked in, suddenly my children didn't even deserve a bedroom in their home. They kicked us out like trash, but they had no idea the storm I was about to bring. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm a mother of two wonderful kids, Lily, who is 8, and Jacob, who is 6. I'm married to Daniel Carter, and for years, I thought we were all part of the same happy family. But my in-laws, Susan and Robert, always had favorites. From the very beginning, they adored Daniel's brother's son, Mason, who they called their golden boy. Every birthday, every holiday, Mason got the best gifts, the best attention, and the best praise. My kids? They were always in the background, barely acknowledged, like they didn't really belong. I tried to brush it off. I told myself, maybe it's just how grandparents are. But the favoritism cut deep. Lily would ask for a simple hug or a word of encouragement, and Susan would barely glance her way, while Mason was showered with praise and affection. Jacob started hiding his feelings, learning that nothing he did would earn their love. I felt helpless, watching my children shrink under the weight of their own family's rejection. The breaking point came one weekend when we visited their home. Mason had arrived unexpectedly, and the difference in treatment was unbearable. My children were told to move to the small guest room, their suitcases unceremoniously thrown into the hallway, so Mason could have the best room. Lily cried softly, and Jacob tried to smile through tears. Daniel didn't say a word. I felt a mix of anger and sorrow, and something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the room, it was everything. The way they spoke to my children, the way they ignored them, the way they made them feel invisible. That day, I realized I could no longer rely on Daniel or his family to see the value of my kids. I had to protect them, and I had to make them understand that their worth was never defined by someone else's favoritism. As I drove away that night, listening to Lily and Jacob quietly crying, I promised myself that this story wouldn't end in heartbreak. I would find a way to turn their cruelty into a lesson, to show them that my children were not invisible, and that every act of dismissal they had done would eventually come back to face them. The storm I had hinted at earlier wasn't just coming, it was already taking shape in my mind, carefully planned and ready to restore the balance that my kids deserved. Every tear my children had shed fueled a determination inside me. I was no longer just Emily Carter, the mother being ignored. I was a mother ready to fight, ready to reclaim what had been denied to my family. And that fight was only just beginning. From the very start, I noticed little things that made me uneasy. Susan and Robert, my in-laws, had a way of showing their favoritism without even trying to hide it. Mason, their golden boy, always received the most expensive toys and gifts. Every birthday, it seemed like they went out of their way to make him feel special. Meanwhile, Lily and Jacob got cheap, thoughtless presents that felt like an afterthought. It wasn't just the gifts, it was the message behind them. My kids were being told, without words, that they didn't matter as much. Thanksgiving was always the hardest. One year, they insisted that Mason sit at the big dining table while Lily and Jacob were shuffled off to a small table in the garage. They decorated it with paper plates and cheap napkins, as if to highlight the difference. I remember watching my kids try to smile through their hurt, trying to be polite even while feeling invisible. Daniel shrugged it off. "It's just how they are," he said, as if that explained everything. But it didn't. Every time I saw the disappointment in my children's eyes, a knot formed in my stomach. Other little things added up too. Susan would interrupt Lily or Jacob whenever they spoke, ignoring them entirely, but Mason's words were listened to like they were gold. At family gatherings, Robert would constantly compare my kids to Mason, praising him for everything and pointing out my kids' mistakes. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but to my children, it felt like a constant judgment. I realized I couldn't let this slide. My kids didn't deserve to grow up feeling small or unwanted in their own family. Quietly, I started documenting everything. I took notes, kept pictures, and even recorded moments when the favoritism was impossible to ignore. It wasn't about revenge yet, it was about protection. I needed proof of what my children were enduring, proof that could someday help them understand that none of this was their fault. Even at home, the impact was clear. Lily became more withdrawn, often retreating to her room with a book, and Jacob became overly eager to please, desperate for acknowledgement he rarely received. I tried to fill the gaps with love and attention, reassuring them every day that they were valuable and loved. But the unfair treatment from Susan and Robert continued like a slow, invisible poison. Each incident, small as it seemed, made me more determined to stand up for my kids. I knew that one day, this behavior would have consequences. I wanted my children to feel safe, to feel seen, and to know that their worth was never defined by how others treated them. Little by little, I started forming a plan, a way to ensure that the cruel favoritism of my in-laws would no longer control our lives. The subtle cruelty that had seemed harmless at first was actually laying the groundwork for the storm that was coming.
That weekend, we arrived at Susan and Robert's house, expecting the usual tension, but hoping it would be manageable. I tried to keep Lily and Jacob cheerful, but there was an uneasiness in the air. We hadn't expected Mason to arrive that day, but when he did, everything changed instantly. Without warning, Susan and Robert announced that Mason would be staying in the best guest room. My kids' room, which they had been assigned weeks before, was suddenly taken away. Their suitcases were shoved into the narrow hallway with no thought, leaving Lily and Jacob standing there, shocked and confused. I could see the fear and hurt in their eyes. They didn't understand why the rules had suddenly changed, why they were being treated as if they didn't belong. I tried to speak up, but Susan waved me off. Emily, Lily, and Jacob need to understand their place. Mason is the heir of this family, she said coldly. Her words hit me like a punch. Every ounce of patience I had left snapped. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to step in, to defend our children. But he didn't. He stayed silent, quietly nodding as if agreeing with them. That silence cut deeper than any words they could say. Lily started to cry softly, clutching her small backpack, while Jacob's face turned red with frustration. I felt my chest tighten, my blood boiling. I wanted to scream, to demand respect for my kids, but I also knew that any argument now would escalate things in a way I couldn't control. Instead, I knelt beside them, holding their hands, whispering that it wasn't their fault, that they deserved love and comfort no matter what anyone else said. Watching my children cry while being treated like intruders sparked a fire inside me. Up until that point, I had been angry and hurt, but now it turned into something sharper, a determination. I realized that staying silent, letting Daniel handle things, wasn't protecting my children. I had to step up. I couldn't let Susan and Robert make them feel worthless. That night, after Mason had gone to bed in the room they had taken from Lily and Jacob, I stayed awake with my kids in the small, cold room they were forced into. I listened to them cry softly, promising them that things would change, that I wouldn't let anyone treat them this way again. That visit had crossed a line. What had been subtle cruelty until now became undeniable, outright humiliation. Something in me snapped that weekend. I didn't know the full plan yet, but I knew this. No one would ever make my children feel like they were less than anyone else. I would find a way to make sure they were safe, loved, and seen. And when the time came, those who had hurt them would understand that their cruelty would have consequences. The storm I had been quietly preparing was closer than ever. The next morning, I woke up to tension in the air, knowing something was brewing. Susan pulled me aside, her voice cold and sharp. "You and your kids don't belong in this house. Go stay in a motel. Mason needs calm," she said, as if speaking to a stranger. Her words were deliberate, meant to humiliate me in front of everyone. I looked at Lily and Jacob, their eyes wide and scared, not understanding why their grandmother would say something so cruel. Before I could respond, Robert appeared, reinforcing her demand. Daniel stayed quiet, his silence cutting deeper than any words. He didn't defend us, didn't ask for a discussion. It was clear he had chosen to side with his parents. My heart ached, not just for myself, but for my children. The people who were supposed to protect and love them had abandoned them entirely. In front of everyone, they made us leave. My children clutched my hands as we walked out, carrying only what we could grab in a rush. Lily's soft sobs and Jacob's small, trembling voice echoed in my ears as we stepped into the cold morning. The air outside felt sharp against my skin, mirroring the sharp pain I felt inside. I tried to soothe them, whispering that everything would be okay, even though my own heart was breaking. As we reached the car, I looked back at the house, the place where we had hoped to feel part of a family. Susan and Robert stood at the doorway, watching us leave with an expression of satisfaction. Daniel didn't move, didn't protest, just stood there as if our departure was expected. In that moment, I realized something important. The marriage I thought was strong had died in my heart. The man I had trusted to support me and my children had failed us completely. Driving away, I felt a mix of anger and determination rising inside me. This wasn't just humiliation, it was a challenge. I would not allow my children to grow up believing they were unwanted or less than anyone else. That day, I made a silent promise to myself. I would protect my kids, and I would make sure those who had hurt them understood the consequences of their cruelty. By the time we reached the motel, I had started thinking clearly about the plan. It wouldn't be about revenge in a reckless way, but about justice. Susan and Robert had shown their true colors, and Daniel had revealed where his loyalties lay. My children deserved better, and I would find a way to give it to them. That morning's forced exit wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a storm that would change everything. I tucked Lily and Jacob into the motel beds, holding them close, letting them know they were safe now. And as I watched them finally start to calm down, a part of me hardened. From that moment on, nothing would stop me from protecting my children and making sure the people who had hurt us would pay for underestimating the mother they tried to break.
After leaving the motel, I found a small apartment for my kids and me. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, a place where Lily and Jacob could feel safe and start to heal. I focused on creating a home where they could sleep without fear and wake up feeling loved. While they unpacked and settled in, I began thinking about the next steps. I knew I couldn't just let Susan, Robert, and even Daniel get away with what they had done. Quietly, I reached out to an attorney. I needed to understand my rights and see what legal options I had. That's when I discovered something shocking. Over the years, I had contributed more to Daniel's business than he had ever admitted. I had signed documents thinking they were routine, but my in-laws had misused them to their advantage. As I dug deeper, I realized I actually owned 40% of the family company. Everything they had tried to take from me, the business, the control, the wealth, was mine by right. I decided to stay calm. On the surface, I let them believe I was broken, that I had no plan and no strength. I didn't call or confront them. I didn't complain or seek sympathy. Instead, I focused on quietly gathering evidence. Every text message where they belittled my kids, every voicemail where Daniel brushed off my concerns, every receipt and record that showed the misuse of my financial documents, I collected it all. I wanted proof, a clear record of the cruelty and the lies. While doing this, I also devoted time to Lily and Jacob. I helped them process their feelings, reassured them that none of this was their fault, and showed them that strength comes from standing up, even quietly. My kids began to smile again, and their laughter filled the apartment, replacing the fear and sadness they had felt for so long. It gave me courage to keep moving forward, knowing I was building a foundation not only for revenge but for a secure future for them. I kept my transformation hidden. To the outside world, and especially to my in-laws, it looked like I was struggling, like I had been defeated. But inside, I was planning every step carefully. I knew the storm was coming, and every piece of evidence I gathered would ensure that they could never hurt us again. I wasn't acting recklessly, I was preparing for a calculated, unstoppable push for justice. In that small apartment, surrounded by boxes and memories of better days, I felt a quiet power growing inside me. Susan and Robert had underestimated me. Daniel had underestimated me. But I knew the truth, I was not broken, I was just beginning. The quiet transformation that started in that apartment would soon become the force that turned their world upside down. After a few weeks in the apartment, Daniel started showing up, but only when it was convenient for him. He acted as if everything was normal, like the weekend at his parents' house had never happened. He spoke to me politely enough, but his words always seemed to favor his parents. "They didn't mean it," he said one afternoon. "You're overreacting, Emily. Just let it go." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything my children had endured, he was asking me to forgive the people who had kicked us out, who had humiliated my kids in their own home. Then he went further, telling me I should apologize to his mother, Susan, for making a scene. I stared at him, stunned, as if he had no idea what had really happened. My kids' tears, their hurt, and my own anger were all being dismissed by the one person I had thought would stand with us. The final blow came when Daniel suggested something even worse. He said, maybe Lily and Jacob should spend less time around the family to avoid tension. He actually expected me to limit my children's presence in their own family, as if that would make things easier. That moment, more than any other, broke whatever trust one had left in him. His loyalty wasn't with us, it had always been with his parents, and now it was undeniable. I stayed calm, but inside, a storm was growing. I quietly recorded everything. Every word, every suggestion, every excuse he made for Susan and Robert went into my collection of evidence. I had been preparing for this moment without even realizing it, proof that Daniel could not be trusted, proof that my in-laws had always been manipulating him to ignore my children's needs. For the first time, I understood clearly that revenge was no longer optional. It wasn't about pride or anger anymore, it was about justice for my kids. They had been mistreated, humiliated, and dismissed. Daniel's failure to protect them or even acknowledge the wrongs only reinforced that the people who had hurt my family needed to face consequences. I looked at Lily and Jacob that evening as they played quietly in the living room, oblivious to the records I had been making. Their innocence, their trust, and their love were worth more than anything Susan and Robert thought they could take away. I realized that everything I had been quietly planning, every piece of evidence I had gathered, every step I had taken in that small apartment, was leading to this moment. From that point on, I made a promise to myself, Daniel's failure would not define us. My children would have the life they deserved, and the people who had tried to crush them would learn that underestimating a mother's love was the gravest mistake they could make. The storm was no longer a threat, it was inevitable, and it was about to change everything. After weeks of careful preparation, my attorney was ready to make the first move. We filed for full custody of Lily and Jacob, proving that their emotional well-being had been neglected for too long. Alongside that, we submitted divorce papers on the grounds of emotional neglect, showing Daniel's consistent failure to protect his own family. But that wasn't all. We included a claim for my rightful ownership in the family business, backed by the documents I had quietly collected. Finally, we requested a restraining order against Susan for the repeated harassment and humiliation she had directed at me and my children. When the legal papers arrived at the Carter household, chaos erupted immediately. Daniel, Susan, and Robert were stunned at first, then furious. They screamed at each other, called me names, and insisted I was ruining the family and destroying everything we built. Their panic was almost satisfying to watch, knowing that they had finally realized I was no longer powerless. Despite their shouting, I remained calm. I didn't respond to their accusations. I had everything prepared, every recording, every receipt, every text message that showed the emotional harm my kids had suffered. The evidence was clear, and it told a story that no amount of screaming could dispute. The case went to court, and I watched as the judge reviewed the evidence. The recordings of Lily and Jacob crying while Susan and Robert dismissed their feelings were powerful. The judge saw the neglect and the favoritism, the emotional harm inflicted over years. Daniel's excuses and explanations fell flat under scrutiny. He had failed as a husband and as a father, and it was undeniable. When the verdict came, it was everything I had hoped for. Full custody of my children was granted to me, ensuring that Lily and Jacob would finally have a safe and loving home where they could grow without fear or humiliation. The divorce was finalized on the grounds of emotional neglect, holding Daniel accountable for his inaction. My claim to 40% of the family business was recognized, giving me the financial stability I needed to protect my children. And the restraining order against Susan ensured that the harassment and intimidation would end immediately. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a sense of relief and vindication. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense, it was about justice and protecting the ones I loved most. For years, Susan, Robert, and Daniel had dismissed me and my children, treating us as if we didn't matter. Now, they had to face the consequences of their actions. Lily and Jacob didn't fully understand the legal details yet, but they could feel the change. They finally had a mother who could protect them completely, a home where they were safe, and a future that couldn't be taken from them. The legal hammer had dropped, and it had changed everything. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control, knowing that the people who had tried to hurt us had finally met the boundaries they could not cross. Susan and Robert had always assumed I didn't understand the business, that I would accept being sidelined while they controlled everything. They had no idea I knew my rights, no idea I had been quietly gathering proof of my contributions and ownership. When the settlement began, my lawyer presented the documents showing I legally owned 40% of the company. Their faces went pale as they realized the power I suddenly held. Owning 40% wasn't just a number on paper, it meant I could freeze accounts, demand audits, and block their decisions. Every move they had been making under the assumption that I had no say could now be stopped. They had spent years making choices without considering my input, believing they were untouchable. Suddenly, the rules had changed, and the game was no longer in their favor. The family business, which had always appeared stable and well-managed, began to collapse under the weight of the chaos I now had the authority to enforce. Frozen accounts disrupted operations, audits uncovered mismanagement, and blocked decisions created confusion and panic. Susan and Robert, who had always presented themselves as in control, were suddenly helpless. They shouted, blamed each other, and tried to find ways around my authority, but everything I needed to maintain control was already in place. Through it all, I remained calm and professional. I didn't yell or threaten. I didn't post online or call the press. While they lost their composure, I stayed collected, reviewing every document, signing what was necessary, and making decisions carefully and deliberately. My calmness was a stark contrast to their panic, and it became a powerful statement. Silence and control were now my tools, and they were far more effective than anger or confrontation could ever have been. Every move I made sent a clear message: underestimating me had been a grave mistake. They had treated my children and me as if we were insignificant, but now the consequences of their arrogance were visible in real time. The business they thought they controlled had become my instrument of justice, a reminder that knowledge and patience are far more powerful than cruelty and favoritism. Even as the chaos unfolded, I focused on what mattered most: protecting Lily and Jacob and ensuring that they would never feel powerless again. Watching their grandparents struggle, unable to manipulate or intimidate us, I felt a sense of vindication, but it was calm, not boastful. Everything had been planned carefully, and now it was working exactly as intended. By staying composed, by letting them falter while I executed my rights, I realized that silence could be stronger than any argument. My power wasn't loud or aggressive, it was strategic and undeniable. Susan and Robert had underestimated me, and the consequences of that miscalculation were now unfolding before their eyes. The family business, once a symbol of their control, had become the proof of my quiet, unstoppable strength. The legal battles and my control over the company had consequences that Susan and Robert hadn't anticipated. One of the most immediate impacts was on Mason, their so-called golden boy. Because accounts were frozen and audits were underway, they couldn't access the funds needed for his expensive boarding school. Suddenly, the child they had spoiled and prioritized above all else was losing the privileges they had spent years protecting. Mason didn't understand why, but the reality was clear: the foundation of their carefully managed family life was crumbling. Meanwhile, Lily and Jacob were flourishing. I enrolled them in a school where they were respected and encouraged, surrounded them with supportive friends and teachers, and continued therapy to help them process the emotional abuse they had endured. For the first time, they felt safe, valued, and truly loved. I made sure every day that they knew they were never unwanted, never overlooked, and always worthy. Their laughter returned, and I could see the sparkle in their eyes that had been dimmed by years of favoritism and neglect. As the in-laws struggled to regain control of the business and Mason's schooling, they finally came to me, humbling themselves in a way I had never seen. Susan and Robert begged me to fix things, to restore Mason's comfort, and to somehow undo the chaos they had caused. Daniel, who had failed to act as a father, tried to convince me that we should forgive and move forward. But I knew exactly what had to be done. I refused. Calmly, clearly, I told them, "You kicked out my children. I just kicked out your entitlement." There was no shouting, no gloating, just the truth delivered with certainty. They realized in that moment that the world had shifted, that they could no longer dictate or manipulate my life or my children's lives. The golden life they had built around Mason was no longer untouchable, and their panic was the only evidence they had ever held power. For Lily and Jacob, this was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice, a lesson in fairness and the consequences of cruelty. They saw that when people treat others unfairly, it can come back in ways they don't expect. But more importantly, they saw that they were safe and protected, that their mother would always fight for them no matter what. The final blow to the in-laws wasn't about humiliation or pride, it was about restoring balance and ensuring that my children's happiness and security could never again be threatened. Susan and Robert learned that favoritism and entitlement had limits, and Daniel learned that failing to protect his family came with consequences. And as I watched Lily and Jacob thrive, I knew that the storm I had quietly prepared had achieved exactly what it was meant to. My children were safe, loved, and unstoppable, and the people who tried to harm them had no power left at all. The divorce was finalized quietly, without drama, but it marked the end of a chapter one had been dreading for years. Daniel and I were officially separated, and with the legal victories and my share of the company, I was financially secure. More than that, I felt a sense of emotional strength I hadn't realized I could have. Every humiliation, every tear, every moment of doubt had shaped me into someone who would never allow my children to be diminished again. Lily and Jacob were thriving in ways I had only dreamed of. School was no longer a place of anxiety but a place of encouragement. Their laughter filled our home, and their confidence grew every day. Therapy helped them process the past, and they began to see that they were worthy of love and respect. Watching them flourish was more rewarding than any court victory or financial gain. Their happiness and security were proof that all the struggles had been worth it. Meanwhile, Daniel moved back with his parents. Their financial mismanagement, combined with my legal actions, left them struggling. Susan and Robert, who had always presented themselves as untouchable, were now blaming each other, shouting and arguing over mistakes they had never anticipated. The family that had once seemed perfect and powerful was unraveling in front of me, yet I never gloatingly interfered. Their chaos was simply the natural consequence of their own actions. I never spoke ill of them, never took to social media, never tried to humiliate them publicly. My life became the proof of my victory. The calm, stable, and happy home I had created for my children was evidence enough. Success, happiness, and security were more powerful than revenge, and they showed that I had risen above cruelty rather than sunk to its level. Sitting with Lily and Jacob one evening, I reflected on everything we had been through. I realized that humiliation can either break you or transform you. It had transformed me. The quiet strength I had cultivated, the careful planning, and the unwavering focus on protecting my children had created a life far better than anything Susan, Robert, or Daniel could have imagined. I wanted my story to be a lesson to anyone watching. Never underestimate a mother who has been humiliated, because the very pain meant to weaken her can become the fuel that drives her strength. They had chosen their golden grandchild, thinking favoritism and wealth could define success, but in the end, they lost everything. My children were safe, loved, and cherished, and I had reclaimed everything they tried to take from us. Looking at Lily and Jacob, smiling and carefree, I knew that our lives were finally ours. The past would always be a part of us, but it no longer had power over us. I had turned every insult, every act of cruelty, and every betrayal into a foundation for a brighter, stronger, and happier life. And in that silence, without any need for revenge or confrontation, I had won everything that truly mattered.